We have a brand new NBC News exclusive report. The Chinese government is hunting down Uyghurs around the world, according to the Woodrow Wilson Center.
For the first time, CNN has interviewed a former member of Chinese security forces who tells CNN he was routinely ordered to arrest and torture Uyghur detainees in truly horrific and barbaric ways.
He said what he personally thinks about China's human rights abuses, its genocide, its murder of the ethnic minority, the Uyghurs.
Yep, it doesn't get much more controversial than this. We jump from a video on the death of Jesus to one on a question of genocide. Now, straight up, I'm going to try and keep editorializing to a minimum. And today is not going to be a deep dive into what is happening inside the de-radicalization camps. I think there's enough commentary already on that. Rather, this video is going to trace the history of the relationship between the Chinese government and the Uyghurs from 1949 when they were brought under the control of Mao, all the way up until 2021 when the USA declared China's actions a genocide.
Determined that the People's Republic of China, under the direction and control of the Chinese Communist Party, has committed genocide and crimes against the predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minority groups.
Some in the media liken the absence of Western opposition to China to the absence of Western opposition to Hitler's treatment of the Jews in the 1930s. And if you think about that for a second, the implications are huge. Theoretically, the supposed liberation of the Uyghur people could be a pretext for another global war. At the very least, it changes the West's war with China from a strategic war to a moral war. And so with the stakes this high, we really ought to know the background of what's going on. Okay, so the Uyghur people are ethnically what's called a Turkic group from Central Asia. Basically, the part of Asia where you find all those countries ending in Stan. And so for many Uyghur people, the nation state that they identify with is not China, but rather East Turkestan. Now, when the Chinese dynasties were powerful, East Turkestan was made to be part of China, with its Chinese name being Xinjiang. However, when they were under weak leadership, East Turkestan ran as an independent society. And so since the 11th century, they'd also been a Muslim society as well. Now, with East Turkestan operating under that murky territory of kind of being part of China but kind of not, they backed Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang during the Chinese Civil War. Basically, they had an alliance of convenience because Xinjiang was governed by the Soviet-backed Xinjiang clique warlords. Now, the Uyghurs hated them because they were seen as colonial overlords, and Chiang Kai-shek hated them because they were affiliated with Mao, and he thought that they were destabilizing his rule over China. Now, as you'd probably know, the Uyghurs backed the wrong horse in the Civil War, and so Mao annexed East Turkestan to have it once again become Xinjiang. So Mao's victory wasn't great news for the Uyghurs for three reasons. Number one, they'd sided with Chiang Kai-shek, and now Mao was beginning his campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries where ex-KMT forces were weeded out. Number two, they were openly religious in a now communist society. And number three, they weren't Han Chinese, which was the majority of China. In 1911, the Manchu Qing dynasty was overthrown, and China had spent a decade fighting against the Japanese, and so Han nationalism was rife throughout the common folk of China. And so in 1955, Xinjiang was declared to be an autonomous region. Effectively, they were allowed their own local government, but they answered to the Communist Party, and of course their resources, mostly in minerals, were yielded to the CCP. Then, from 1957 to 1967, 2 million Han Chinese migrated to Xinjiang for job prospects, and this was encouraged by the party, probably as a way to stabilize the region. With competition for jobs, ethnic tensions flared between the Uyghurs and the Han Chinese, and resistance began. The East Turkestan People's Party were the separatist rebel group that popped up in the late 1960s with the ultimate aim of independence. Now, if you're a long-term viewer of the channel, you'd know that the 1960s was the decade of the Sino-Soviet split, as both nations sought to become the global leaders in communism. With this new separate group destabilizing the Chinese government, the Soviet Union funded and armed the ETPP, with a failed insurrection on Xinjiang taking place in 1969. Now, in the 1970s, the east of China wasn't particularly stable itself, as the nation went through Mao's Cultural Revolution, and then after Mao's death, it took the party a couple of years of trying to figure out if Deng Xiaoping or Hua Guofeng was its leader. In the 1980s, China's emphasis was primarily on economic prosperity, and so in the 1990s, the Chinese Communist Party could once again resume its focus on the unstable outer rim of Xinjiang. The 1990s also followed the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, and the party was concerned that the Beijing demonstrators, some of which were violent, would inspire another Uyghur insurrection. This gave way to the first wave of China's Strike Hard campaign against terrorism. It's also worth noting that by the 1990s, terrorism was seen as a viable strategy by much of the Islamic world to compensate for the superior forces and resources of the Western world. For example, in 1983, Hezbollah coordinated suicide bombings killing 241 American and 58 French soldiers in response to Israel invading southern Lebanon. Though China wasn't the West, Turkic separatists still viewed them as colonial overlords, and the bombing attacks began. In February of 1992, a bus was bombed in Xinjiang's capital, Urumqi, resulting in 3 deaths. The attack was attributed to the shock brigade of the Islamic Reformist Party. Fast forward 5 years to 1997, and things really started to escalate. A man by the name of Abdul Halil Abdurrahman organised what was called a Meşrep. Essentially, this was a Turkic cultural meeting that involved music, poetry and dance. However, the Communist Party suspected this of being a meeting to organise an insurrection, and Abdurrahman was arrested under the Strike Hard campaign and beaten to death. The Uyghurs then took to the streets in protest, shouting "Independence for Xinjiang," and they used clubs, water cannons and even tear gas. But just like in Tiananmen, the government crackdown was swift and brutal, with at least 9 being killed and the death toll potentially rising to 30. With tensions further flared, those radical Turkic separatists coordinated the Urumqi bombings in February. 3 bombs exploded across 3 buses, resulting in 9 deaths, including at least 4 children. Then in March, another bomb exploded in Beijing, killing 2 people. Uyghur separatists once again took responsibility for the attack. Now, for the next 10 years, relatively little would happen, partly because China supported America in the war on terror, and if the US was antagonized, any hope for Turkic independence would be over. Okay, so for this next section, I had to cut out about 1,000 words because it really caused the video to blow out, but basically there were countless attacks for about 8 years straight. For your average Chinese citizen, it would have felt similar to how Europe felt back in 2017. So police raided a terrorist camp in 2007, and then in 2008, 4 days before the Beijing Olympics, the Kashgar attack saw 2 men, widely accepted to be Turkic separatists, drive a truck into jogging police officers before attacking them with grenades and machetes, killing 16 of them. Things escalated even further in 2009 with the Shaoguan incident. Basically, migrant Uyghur workers fought with Han Chinese workers in a toy factory over false allegations of sexual assault on a Han Chinese woman. 2 Uyghurs were killed in the uproar and 118 were injured, most of them Uyghur. This then led to 3,000 Uyghurs to riot in Urumqi, with 197 people being killed, most of them Hans or non-Uyghur minorities. In 2010, there was the Aksu bombing, in which a Uyghur man detonated explosives in a crowd of police, killing 7 people. In 2011, a second Kashgar attack saw 2 Uyghur men hijack a truck, kill its driver, drive into a crowd of pedestrians, and then leave the truck to stab the crowd with knives. 6 people were killed and 27 were injured. Now, there were plenty more. For example, a 2012 attack in Yicheng killed 20 and injured 18. In 2013, riots saw 21 people killed, and then a 4-wheel drive was driven through a stone bridge in Beijing near Tiananmen Square, killing 5. Then, in March of 2014, there was the Kunming railway attack, where knife terrorists killed 31 and injured 140. And then finally, in May of 2014, China saw its worst attack yet, as 2 suicide car bombings in Urumqi killed 43 people and injured over 90. As a result, China sentenced 9 people to death, and overall, from 2007 to 2014, there were over 1,000 deaths from these terrorist attacks. So, after the end of Strike Hard in the 1990s, the Chinese government's first major attempt at seriously addressing the Uyghur issue came in 2009. A party official by the name of Zhang Chunxian was placed in charge as the party secretary of Xinjiang. Chunxian's approach was to focus on economically developing Xinjiang to become a wealthier province. The theory was that if Xinjiang experienced a socio-economic rise that the east of China had seen, the terrorist attacks would stop. Now, this provoked strong debate within the party, with Xi Jinping, the then vice president, strongly opposing it as being too soft. By the time Xi had come to power in 2012, the approach seemed to have done little to have stopped the attacks, and then after the 2 major attacks in 2014, Xi Jinping instituted the second wave of Strike Hard. Village-based work teams were tasked with visiting each household to identify radical elements, and they concluded that 30% of those were extremist. In 2016, Zhang Chunxian was replaced by Tibetan security veteran Chen Quango, who was much more hardline and stationed police and paramilitary police every few hundred feet in Urumqi. Then the big one, in 2017, reports about concentrated educational centres started to emerge. In 2019, the BBC released its famous expose on the camps, where it alleged that the Uyghurs were subject to brainwashing and that in these camps, their cultural identity was totally removed. In 2020, reports emerged claiming that population control methods were being enforced, such as forced abortions and the sterilisation of women. Now, my job isn't to weigh in on what's happening inside the camps. To be honest, it's hard to decisively know. I'd encourage you to view the documentaries and the evidence for yourself and come to your own conclusion. And so in June of 2020, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act was signed.
Madam Speaker, Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping's ongoing genocide against the approximately 10 million Uyghurs living in Xinjiang in northwestern China demands action.
And then in January of 2021, the PRC's treatment of the Uyghurs was officially declared a genocide by the USA. And so let's just have a look at the geopolitics behind this all. Now, if you have a West Wing way of viewing global politics, in that you see it as the good of freedom versus the evil of tyranny, this section will probably mean little to you in how you understand the Uyghur situation. If, on the other hand, you're like me and have a house of cards way of viewing global politics, in that global leaders view the globe as a giant chessboard, this section will really influence how you understand the Uyghur situation. So, 3 months before the Uyghur Act, it was actually inconceivable just how hard the US would posture on China. In January of 2020, Trump signed the Phase 1 agreement with China to effectively end the 2-year-long trade war, and this was the peak of Sino-US relations under Trump. Just afterwards, Trump downplayed the spread of the new coronavirus and insisted that Xi had it under control. In fact, this show of support lasted as long as March when he insisted on it again. However, on the 19th of March, the S&P 500 stock market index crashed by nearly a third of its value. Given that Trump was preparing for the re-election campaign by boasting of a strong stock market under his presidency, this was fatal and he couldn't afford to be seen at fault for the pandemic. As you might remember, Trump's messaging shifted to blaming China
virus.
And by April, Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, publicly promoted the idea of decoupling America from China. Trump also signed executive orders banning TikTok and WeChat, though the ban never became effective. So within 3 months, Trump's messaging on China completely shifted. The cynic would say China no longer served Trump's economic agenda, but rather served as a country to be vilified and deemed as needing to be tough on to help Trump win the upcoming election. In this context, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act was signed off by Trump in June 2020 that sanctioned individuals such as the Xinjiang boss, Chen Quango. As Kevin Rudd points out, this idea was actually initially floated to Trump in 2018, but Trump refused it as it went against his trade strategy. Fast forward to January of 2021 and it escalated even further. Trump and Pompeo's parting gift was to officially label China's activities as genocide, which for an incumbent Biden administration wasn't exactly ideal for managing the relationship. The PRC's unfavorability rates amongst Americans soared from 50% to 77% throughout 2020, and so the risk-adverse Biden administration doubled down on the call. This put the world in a tricky situation as well. For the first time, other countries were forced to side with one of the superpowers at the expense of the other. Countries like the UK, Netherlands and Australia agreed that it was a genocide, yet a number of Western nations did not in fact back the motion. For example, New Zealand said that what China was doing was dodgy and showed a disregard for human rights, yet the use of genocide was such a loaded word that had connotations of, say, Hitler, and that it wasn't appropriate to use that word to describe China's actions, and that this flat out wasn't a productive motion to flippantly introduce. And so that's where I'm going to leave it. Obviously, this chapter of history is far from over, but knowing the story to this point is so vital. So if you found this video helpful, leave a like so that YouTube knows to get this out to people, and leave a comment with what you think will happen next. If you want more videos to help set the context, I'd recommend this one we did on Xi Jinping's predecessor, Hu Jintao. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.